In this video, we'll look at the period from the election of 1860 in November 1860 until Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861. And during that period, James Buchanan was still the president, although the lame duck president. And nobody was sure exactly what would happen. Certainly in the South, there was no uniformity of opinion. Some Southerners wanted to immediately secede, and others said, no, we ought to delay and see how things unfold. And if we do secede, we ought to try to coordinate a collective action. Republicans assumed that all this secession rhetoric was just a campaign thing. Once the election passed, things would calm down. They didn't realize just how strong the sentiment for secession was in the South. In any event, when the telegraphs flashed news of Lincoln's victory, the South Carolina legislature immediately voted to form a convention to consider secession. And this convention voted to secede. Here you can see all of the cheering going on. Within 6 weeks, 6 other deep Southern states did the same thing. Delegates were elected to secession conventions after short-spirited campaigns, and these secession conventions voted overwhelmingly to secede. The average was 84% for secession. Probably not a true reflection of the total popular sentiment for secession, because the conventions were undoubtedly populated by the rich plantation owners, but it nevertheless was a reflection of the enthusiasm of the secession activists. Here you can see the historical mark in the Ordinance of Secession passed by Georgia. Quickly, delegates from these 6 seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and you can see where they met here. There they voted to create what they called the Confederate States of America. What they began to do is write a provisional constitution and began debating, initially the operation of their new government. They also chose the Mississippian plantation owner, former Secretary of War and Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis as their provisional president, and you can see Davis here. As the 6 state delegates began to form the Confederate States of America and the job of writing a permanent constitution, people began to debate whether what the secession had done was it a revolution or not. In short, whether they had acted legally in leaving under existing law. And initially, in the wake of Lincoln's election, people proclaimed secession akin to 1776. The tea has been thrown overboard again, they declare. Soon, however, Confederate leaders began to realize that speaking of secession as a revolution of rebels implied that they had broken the law and acted unconstitutionally from the U.S. Constitution. And the Southern states had, of course, always claimed that the Constitution embraced their view of slavery. So as a result, Confederate leaders began to quote from speeches Republicans and abolitionists had given over the years, suggesting a free market, free soil revolution was sweeping America. It was them who were revolutionary, not the South. At its base was whether the states or the federal government had true sovereignty, and sovereignty is the final say on matters of dispute. In the Southern view, of course, the states had existed before the Union, and they had voluntarily joined a compact of states, from which they could voluntarily leave. In the Southern view, if the Founding Fathers had called state conventions to ratify the Constitution, then the states could call other conventions to repudiate it, to leave. In short, in the Southern view, the states were the truly sovereign, not the federal government. Now, in the Northern view, of course, it was different. The state constitutional conventions in the 1780s had agreed to form a sovereign country, they said, and specified mechanisms for it to function as a sovereign country. By voting to join in the 1780s, they had voted to transfer sovereignty to the federal government. Heck, for over a century and a half, the Northerners said the U.S. had acted as a sovereign, not deferring to states. In the North, the Northern view was that, the federal government was a true sovereign, not the states. So it was a question of sovereignty. The question of sovereignty had, in fact, emerged as a problem earlier in U.S. history. But each time it had, the central question of who was sovereign, the federal government or the states, had been avoided. The question had quietly remained unanswered. In the 1790s, for example, the federal government had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they arguably restricted free speech and other basic constitutional rights, people argued. In response, without any type of judicial review at the time, the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. It simply said that those Alien Sedition Acts did not apply within their states. It implied that they were sovereign, and the federal law didn't apply to, and federal law in this case didn't apply to their states. After a change in administrations after a presidential vote, however, the new administration abandoned the Alien and Sedition laws, and thus the central question remained unanswered. 3 decades or so later, in the 1830s, the U.S. federal government passed a high tariff, which South Carolina didn't like, and South Carolina declared in response, hey, that tariff doesn't apply to our state. This was known as the Nullification Crisis. South Carolina was going to nullify that high tariff, and at its core, it was an issue of sovereignty. The South Carolina had the right, they said, to nullify a law of the federal government. The Nullification Crisis, however, was diffused by Henry Clay, who crafted a compromise, a tariff that slowly went down. And thus the central question of who was sovereign, the federal government or the states, really wasn't answered. And obviously, with slavery, the question of sovereignty, who gets to decide the answer, is going to be even more caustic. And this time, they're not going to be able to compromise it. There were nevertheless several attempts during the sort of lame duck Buchanan presidency to reach a compromise, but Buchanan reacted poorly and hardly solved the matter. He declared secession was illegal, and that pleased the North, of course. But then he turned around and said the federal government had no right to, quote, coerce a state to remain. The question of what constituted coercion was a matter of interpretation. The South and the new Confederate government declared their secession peaceful and legal, but realizing that it might come to a fight, had quietly encouraged the states in the Confederacy to form an army of 100,000 soldiers. More troublesome, some of these states had begun to seize federal property within their borders, declaring it their own property. A question, therefore, was defending federal property considered coercion? Was raising an army in reaction to the South's attempt to raise an army considered coercion? Buchanan's response was unclear, and it was kind of useless. In the North, most Northerners still hoped that the secession fever would pass with time, that tensions would cool. Now, some, including abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, shown here, said, good riddance, let the South go. They assumed that secession and slavery would isolate the South, and eventually their economies would, and the public opinion, would give up slavery. They'd never liked the Constitution in the first place, and saw the United States as no longer tainted by the evils of slavery. Now, other abolitionists, however, probably the majority, felt like letting the South go would abandon the slaves there for too long, and it had to be fixed immediately. Many Northerners, as I say, were open to at least considering some compromise to cool the secession fever. If nothing else, simply the debate itself might delay the hotheads and cool tensions. Lincoln, the president-elect, remained quiet on the question of additional compromise in slavery, regarding slavery in the territories. He didn't want to inflame tensions even more. Of course, the big fear in most Northerners was the rest of the Upper South, including places like Virginia and Maryland, voting to secede and join the new Confederacy. In this map here, you can see the dark blue are the states that have claimed to be part of the new Confederacy, and in the gray are the southern slave states that had not yet joined the Confederacy. The light blue were the slave states that never did join the Confederacy, and the red states are the free states. But, these states, these border slavery states like Virginia and Maryland, were debating whether they should call their own secession conventions to vote. And so Northerners were worried. Most, like Virginia, did decide to call a convention, but it moved slowly, waiting for developments. Lincoln and many Northerners hoped that a compromise might keep the Upper South in the Union. At least, again, the debate would go on for some time, calming tensions. Lincoln feared that quick action might drive the Upper South into the Confederacy. To try to reach a compromise, both houses of Congress in the lame duck session formed committees to consider potential compromises. In the House of Representatives, it was called the Committee of 33, with one representative from each state. In the Senate, the committee had only 13 people and was called the Committee of 13. As these committees debated, a Kentucky senator named John J. Crittenton introduced a series of constitutional amendments that collectively became known as the Crittenton Compromise. Here you can see a picture of Congress debating the Crittenton Compromise. The Crittenton Compromise calls for a national referendum to consider constitutional amendments that would be perpetually binding, unrepealable, and unamendable, for all time. The thrust was to extend the Missouri Compromise borderline of 36 degrees 30 minutes westward throughout all the lands, all the way to the Pacific. Moreover, and importantly, it said that the line would apply to existing territories and those yet to be acquired. He also called for amendments preventing Congress from abolishing slavery in D.C., from interfering with the domestic slave trade, and for an indemnity for Southern owners of slaves who were prevented from recovering their property by Northern state personal liberty laws. Implicit, I should add, in all of this was the supremacy, the sovereignty of the federal government over the states. Republicans immediately let it be known that they would not support the Crittenton Compromise because it repudiated the central tenets of their campaign, the idea of, no new slavery in any territories. So Lincoln was quiet, as not to anger the Upper South, but in private he lobbied Republicans to defeat the Crittenton Compromise. Meanwhile, the delegates in Montgomery, forming the Confederate States of America, adopted a permanent constitution, and it declared that each state was sovereign and explicitly guaranteed slavery in all states and all territories. It added provisions rejecting the old Whig American system, no protective tariffs, just revenue tariffs, and no federal money for internal improvements, that sort of thing. It elected the president for one 6-year term, and although never implemented, it did allow cabinet members to speak on the floor of the Confederate Congress. In virtually all other ways, however, it simply resembled the U.S. Constitution, and you could say that the delegates didn't want to feel too radical because they didn't want to offend the Upper South. They wanted the Upper South to join. It just allowed a domestic slave trade. It didn't allow an international slave trade. In any event, as the debate unfolded, most radical realized that if the Confederacy were to survive, it needed more populous and more urban Upper South support, and thus they tried not to make their debate itself appear too radical. They did elect the provisional president, Jefferson Davis, the permanent president, and his vice president was Alexander Stephens, shown on the right. Meanwhile, William Seward, who had lost to Lincoln in the 1860 Republican nomination, he was trying to come up with his own compromise. He proposed simply to let New Mexico territory, including now New Mexico and Arizona today, in as slave states. And while Republicans, of course, are going to reject this because, once again, like the Crittenton Compromise, it required them to give up the central tenets of their platform that slavery couldn't extend into any territories, it was at least another attempt at compromise. Right before Lincoln's inauguration, one last attempt at compromise was suggested by the wavering Upper South state of Virginia, a proposal to have all states send delegates to a so-called peace convention in Washington. They met at the Willard Hotel in Washington, and you can see the plaque that's outside the door there. And in the bottom here, you can see troops that were walking past the Willard Hotel on Lincoln's inauguration. Seward convinced enough Republicans to support delegates to this convention, but no one in the party was really willing to repudiate their platform to any degree, so I'm not sure it had much chance like the other attempts at compromise. In the end, the Peace Convention didn't do anything more than make a proposal for a modified Crittenton Compromise. It was quickly rejected by the northern states, and thus it too didn't work. As all these compromises were being debated, Lincoln was preparing to come to Washington for his inauguration. Rumors persisted that Lincoln would be assassinated, and you can see here a January 1861 letter to Lincoln outlining the security precautions being taken for his arrival in Washington before his inauguration. Lincoln took an overnight train and arrived unannounced in Washington in the early morning hours of February 23rd. Cartoonists had a field day, and rumors suggested that he'd arrived in a disguise, a Scottish kilt, or some called it a dress. They were trying to embarrass Lincoln, and Lincoln said he always regretted that he had not arrived with all the publicity and fanfare that most presidents did. When Lincoln gave his inaugural address, he still hoped for a compromise because he knew the Upper South had not yet joined the Confederacy. He didn't want to say or do anything that would drive the Upper South into rebellion. At the same time, however, he worried that too much leniency toward the Southern states might embolden Southern radicals there as well. It's a tough line, trying to assert federal sovereignty and national authority while at the same time reassuring Southerners that the government threatened none of their interest. In his famous inaugural address, Lincoln walked a fine line. I should note that when Lincoln gave his address, they were still building the dome we have today of the Capitol, and you can see the construction of it in the background. Lincoln insisted all the way through the Civil War that the construction go on. As I say, Lincoln had a tough address to make in his first inaugural address. Seward, who Lincoln had picked as Secretary of State, it was interesting that Lincoln picked his political rivals to be in his cabinet. He brought them all together in a show of unity. So anyway, Seward said that he ought to tone down some of the original harsh tone he'd written. Anyway, in the end, Lincoln reiterated that both the federal government was supreme and would enforce all laws everywhere, and that his administration would not act to interfere with slavery where it already existed in the Southern states. In an olive branch, he even suggested that if the Southern states interfered with the operations of the federal government, he would, quote, suspend the operations for a temporary period of time. While Lincoln stated famously, "We must not be enemies," and promised no invasion, many Southerners still saw his statement of federal supremacy and promised to enforce all laws a declaration of war. The reaction was disappointing to Lincoln, who still hoped to calm tensions until the tempers cooled. If he could just stall, then maybe the South would come to see his administrations as less of a threat. Unfortunately, as we'll see in the next video, that didn't take place. In any event, this concludes the video on the period from the election of 1860 through Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861.